So a few weeks ago, we got the news that Lonzo Ball had reached a major milestone in his recovery and beginning 5-on-5 full court action, and he was doing so without any setbacks. But at that time, we hadn't seen any footage or highlights of him participating in these scrimmages. We didn't know if he was scrimmaging against trainers, amateurs, or other professional basketball players. And I had Stacey King on the channel last week, and I had asked him whether or not he had actually seen any footage of Lonzo doing 5-on-5, and he said that he had, and that he looked great and was very optimistic of his return to the court. But yesterday, we got our first good glimpse publicly of Lonzo Ball playing 5-on-5 in an open run style scrimmage where other NBA players were playing as well. And I have to say, Lonzo looked pretty damn good, better than what I would have expected, especially knowing he's not just playing against some Joe Schmo who played high school varsity basketball. And so while I think most of you have seen the few minutes of footage of Lonzo working out playing 5-on-5 basketball, I thought I would share my thoughts on what I like seeing from this brief footage, but also putting a few things into perspective for some of us Bulls fans who might be a little too overly optimistic in seeing Lonzo Ball back out there on the court. So what's going on, everyone? You're listening to Bulls Central here. Hope you're all doing well. I know I've said this before, but I always was skeptical of the idea of Lonzo Ball ever returning to playing in an NBA game until we got to see him play 5-on-5 and was actually showing up well and looking effective or close to his former self while doing it. So the footage that was shared by Chris Johnson, who was a basketball trainer, you had guys like DeAndre Jordan, Daniel Gafford, JaVale McGee, Jaren Jackson Jr. I believe I saw Lonnie Walker and Tristan Thompson out there as well, but Lonzo was predominantly featured in the open run, with him being the primary ball handler and getting a lot of usage on the court. And I go back to what I've said before in terms of the more optimistic outlook of Lonzo returning to the league and why this isn't a scenario like Derrick Rose, whose greatness and game relied so much on his athleticism and explosiveness. Of course, even Lonzo at his peak is not the same player as Derrick Rose was in his prime, but Lonzo, his game is not as heavily predicated on his athleticism. A player is never going to lose their basketball IQ. They're never going to lose their court vision and instincts. Maybe they won't be able to execute it as well if their movement is limited, but you're never going to lose the mental side of basketball no matter how bad or how many injuries you've had over the course of your career. But what was encouraging to me and what we saw from Lonzo is not only is he moving well, weaving through players, finding lobs in the pick and roll, getting the ball quickly down the court, getting the ball in the paint through a narrow lane, full court heaves passes on an outlet. Like, some of his plays were very reminiscent of the Lonzo Ball we remember in those brief 35 games he played with the Bulls at the beginning of the 21-22 season. His handles look solid for a guy who hasn't played in 2.5 years. His lateral movement looked decent, and most importantly, well, I shouldn't say most importantly, but something I consider to be key because it's what made Lonzo all the more effective in his impact when he was on the court, was his lights out shooting. And boy, did his jumper look smooth in that footage. Quick release, step back jumpers, pulling up shots coming off screens. Again, eerily similar to the Lonzo we saw before he got injured. Don't forget, Lonzo shot a ridiculous 42% from 3 on over 7 attempts per game, some of the most efficient shooting in the entire league before he got injured. And hey, if at a minimum Lonzo is able to maintain his shot, still find ways to get open and help space the floor, even if he's not the same player that he used to be in everything else, that's a big win, especially for a Bulls team that so desperately needs shooting, even more so after losing their best 3-and-D player in Alex Caruso. Now, all that said, we do have to manage expectations here a bit. First and foremost, the most obvious, an open run practice in the middle of the summer is never going to be as close to the level of physicality and competition in an actual NBA game. Like, even though the guys are playing hard, they're not full out sprinting up and down the court. The defense is minimal, which I did want to call out that Lonzo's defense was a bit suspect, but again, that's because no one really plays their best defense in a scrimmage, which also means Lonzo probably isn't going to get the kind of looks that he saw in the scrimmage that he would in an NBA game. He's going to be much more heavily guarded and won't have as much free reign to just pull up and shoot a deep 3 without a man in his face. Lonzo is obviously going to be seeing much more contact when trying to get into the lane than we saw in these scrimmages. And then also, it was a 16-minute video highlighting most of the good things we saw from Zoe. We don't know if some of the footage was edited out where he was turning the ball over or hoisting up bad shots. Hopefully that's not the case, and it probably isn't, but a reminder that it's a narrow view of what we got to see from Lonzo in a 5-on-5 scrimmage setting, not an actual NBA game. Lonzo still has a lot of work ahead of him to get back to the level of physicality that is going to be expected of him in an NBA game where players are going to be initiating contact, a lot more bumps and bruises that a player sees in every NBA game, the speed of play, which is not at all the same or what we saw in that footage. Like really, even though all this is very encouraging, and it's honestly starting to look more and more certain that Lonzo will be returning this season, but until we see him in live NBA action, we really don't know what to expect in terms of the level of caliber of player Lonzo Ball will be post 3 surgeries. But the fact that he's been able to get this far, being able to be cleared for any and all basketball activities and showing flashes of the old Lonzo Ball even in an open run setting is huge. It is going to be interesting though to see how everything plays out, because man, if Lonzo comes back fully healthy, looks like the old Lonzo or even 80% of what he used to be, it's drastically going to change the overall complexion of this roster, especially after the Bulls traded for Josh Giddey, and it puts them in even more of a bind if we see Zach and Lonzo thriving together like we saw back in 21-22, and the Bulls find themselves in a situation where they're better than expected and poised to lose that top 10 protected 2025 pick. Because a healthy Lonzo, people forget, he was the oil that made that engine run. He was the glue guy that made everything work when the Bulls were at the top of the Eastern Conference. A healthy Lonzo means a better Bulls team and gives them a higher ceiling. I'm getting a little too ahead of myself here though. Let's see how Lonzo shows up even in preseason, or hell, even training camp, before we start talking about him returning to form. But anyway, just wanted to briefly update you guys on the status of Lonzo now that we've been able to see him play 5-on-5 and share my thoughts on the matter. I would love to hear what you guys think. Let me know in the comments. As always, be sure to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.